Nature of Knowledge, John Locke. In previous lectures, including the Bertrand Russell and the Descartes lectures, we've spoken about the question of how do we know what we know. So again, we're talking here about Locke's epistemology, his theory of knowledge. And the question is, what is it we know, and how do we know that we know? And so the excerpt that you have from Locke, I should say, consists of five main areas. So first, we want to talk a little bit about the methodology of Locke. How does he go about solving this question of what knowledge is? We go through his rejection of innate ideas. So if we look back to someone like Descartes, part of Descartes' notion was that we can get knowledge just by reflecting on the operation of our mind, right? So I can doubt all the physical world, all of the physical existence, and still come up with knowledge. So what he's saying is that I have certain innate ideas, right? Innate knowledge about the world around me, about the existence of a divine being, all of those things Descartes seems to indicate we have without any reference to experience. So Locke is going to reject that sort of notion and say, no, there is no innate ideas. All of our knowledge is going to come from, as you see here, number 3, experience. So our knowledge comes from experience. That experience translates into ideas. So from our experience, we get then the origin of our ideas, those things that we think about in our mind. And then finally, Locke talks a little bit about the way we perceive things in our mind. So the word perception for Locke, or perceiving for Locke, isn't the way we use the word perceive. For him, perceive is more like awareness of the things in our mind. So the only thing we think about are ideas. But when he talks about perception, he's talking about perception in the mind. Experience is the word that we might sort of use interchangeably with perception. So our experiences, the objects in the world that cause our senses to form ideas, that's what we commonly would say, someone has a perception of something or an experience of something. We normally take those two things as interchangeably. Locke doesn't. Locke says experience is one thing, perception is something that happens internally. So again, we're dealing with the same sort of issues. How do we have knowledge? How do we establish what we know? And how do we know that we know? So let's begin with his methodology. So Locke is an empiricist, and he's looking, as I said, for the origin of our ideas. And he says that the way in which we're going to go about this to find our ideas is that his claim is we start out as what he calls a tabula rasa, right? A blank slate. And that the only knowledge we can get comes from the ideas in our head, right? So those ideas, knowledge comes from ideas, but where do the ideas themselves come from is the question. For Locke, the answer is very simple. Our ideas come from experience. It comes from the things that we perceive in the external world. So he's rejecting any kind of rationalist approach like Descartes. He's saying, no, you can't get knowledge. There's nothing there in our mind to think about. We have no innate knowledge. There's nothing we know. Now, we have certain powers. Our mind has certain powers to do things once we do have various experiences. So once I look at the world and I see objects in the world, I see different colors. These things sort of impinge on my senses. Then I have a knowledge of certain things, right? I have knowledge of colors or of shapes or of various things to think about. But prior to that experience, I have no knowledge of it, right? There's nothing there to think about. So it's not as if I could come into the world if I had no sense experience whatsoever, then I would have no idea. So we know this sort of thing, that Locke was right when we look at people who've regained senses, who've lost senses early on. So there are some people who, as very young, perhaps infants, have lost their sight. And then years later, they're able to regain their sight. And it turns out that if someone who hasn't seen something like a ball, let's say we have a red ball, and they say, okay, someone who lived for 10, 15, 20 years without ever seeing a red ball. So they may have held a red ball. Of course, they couldn't tell what color it is, but they could feel it. They could feel the shape of the red ball and things like that. And now suddenly they regain their sight. And we actually know that individuals in those situations, that when they regain their sight, if I were to put sort of a box in front of them and a ball in front of them and say something like a triangular object, right? Like a little pyramid in front of them. And I put those three things in front of them and I say, point to the ball. The person who's regained their sight wouldn't be able to tell me which one of those things were a ball. Now, the minute they touch the various objects, they could immediately tell me what the ball was. So what they would need to do is touch the ball first, then say, oh, that's what a ball looks like. So they wouldn't have any knowledge, no idea of what a ball looks like. They would only have the sense of touch with those objects. So it's an interesting case that there are people who can actually see an object and not recognize it if they've had no prior experience of it. So until it gets a label, until they have that knowledge, that's when they can actually understand what the object is. So this is Locke's view, right? Locke is going to reject the idea of innate ideas. Now, why does he reject this? It's not, you don't have to necessarily take his word for it. He says there's a lot of good arguments why we should reject this. He says, first of all, there's no universal consent on innate ideas. So which innate ideas actually exist, which don't? And so there are people who would believe that there are universal ideas, innate ideas, but people disagree about which ones there are. And Locke says, look, the fact is that we're actually arguing over nothing. There is no universal set of innate ideas, and every innate idea we point to has some correspondence to something in reality. All right, so he's going to say there's no universal consent to this. He also notes that children, and if you excuse the word idiots, that there are certain things children simply don't know, right? So if ideas were innate, then it would seem that you would be born with certain types of knowledge that you wouldn't need to be taught. So for instance, I'd point to shapes, and you'd be able to identify the shapes. Or perhaps you'd have knowledge of certain laws of physics. So we know with children, for example, that if you show very young children, a few months old, if you show them experiments with puppets, and you have sort of a little puppet stage set up, and you have it so the puppets appear to be floating or sitting on a box or a chair, and then someone comes and removes the chair and the puppet stays floating, so you can't see the person's hand. Say they're on a stick behind them, so you can't actually see that there's something holding the puppet up. And very young children, when you remove the thing that's holding them and the puppet appears to be floating on the little stage, they don't react at all. Why? Because they don't recognize that, oh, there's gravity and things fall towards the ground. And if they don't, then that should be surprising. There should be something strange about that. Now, when a child gets to 7, 8 months old, when you perform the same experiment on older children, they actually look surprised. So when something's removed from under the puppet and the puppet appears to be floating, the children are sort of shocked, right? They show like, wait a minute, what's going on? This is, again, according to someone like Locke would say, well, the reason why the young children don't respond and the older children do is not because there's some innate idea that's come to light, like, oh, yes, if something's not supported, it should fall. What's happened is that the older children have had enough experiences to know that, oh, gee, when something's pulled out from under me, I'm going to fall. When I pull out a block from a large tower, the tower is going to come down. The things just don't normally float. So that's another reason why Locke says we don't have innate ideas. We can look at things like children and idiots, as he puts it, and say, oh, they just don't understand the way the world works. But if ideas were innate, wouldn't they? And he also says, look, let's assume there are innate ideas, but you don't know you have innate ideas. So he says to know is to know that you know. So if you say, oh, no, those ideas are just in there, you just don't know it. Well, then what does it mean to know something, right? Knowledge seems to require, on most accounts, that you actually know that you know something. To say I know what time it is not to say that somewhere hidden in my mind is the actual time. It's to say, no, I actually know the time, and I'm aware of the fact that I know the time, right? So for Locke, he's going to reject any sort of innate ideas that other philosophers have posited exist. And this goes back to the ancient Greeks. Even Plato thought that we are born in, when our rational part of our being comes into existence, takes on a physical form, even Plato thought, oh, that rational part has had full knowledge or access to all the universal knowledge, and that what we're doing in life is actually remembering the things that we once knew. Of course, even with Plato, it seems that our remembering always seems to come from some kind of external experience. But he thinks no, that all the knowledge is actually there even before we're born. So Locke's going to reject these innate ideas. He's going to say, no, that's not how we get knowledge. Where does our knowledge come from? Well, as I mentioned already, very, very simply, it comes from experience. Right? Our knowledge comes from experience. And there are two types of experience for Locke that leads to the ideas. First is sensation, and we've seen this again with Russell's sort of introduction. He makes a slightly different distinction, right, between the sense data and our experience of that data. At this point, Locke doesn't really make that sort of that separation of ideas, but we have sensation, color, heat, cold, soft, hard, bitter. These are all sensations that we have, right? Those come from our experience. He also says there's another source of our ideas, and those come from reflection on the sensations and on our experiences. So doubting, believing, reasoning, knowing, willing, all of these are another type of experience. Now, those are sort of an internal experience, right? We don't doubt, doesn't come from outside, but we actually have, when we reflect on the operations of our mind and what we're doing with our ideas, our mind seems to have the ability to do these sorts of things: doubting, believing, reasoning, knowing, willing, and so forth. So this is where we get, or this is the source of our ideas come from experience, from sensation and reflection. So one you can think of as an external experience, and the other as an internal experience, that is reflection on our ideas. So the origin of our ideas then comes from these external objects, right, from sensation. And what it is we're thinking about, the various ideas, come from the various qualities in the objects of experience. So when I look at the external world with whatever I'm looking at, whether it's a tree or a car or whatever, those things have certain qualities about them, right? So there are what Locke says primary qualities of the objects I see around me, and the secondary quality, and that's the substance of the thing, right? These primary and secondary qualities constitute the substance of objects. Now, you'll notice here that, again, we started with Russell and talking about Russell's sort of overview of what is substance, what is the stuff that underlies everything. Locke's distinction is a little bit more intuitive or common sense, right? He's simply going to say, well, whatever substance is, it's a quality of things, right? It's a quality of the things that we have in our ideas, or that cause our ideas. So it's the stuff out there. So he had what was called a corpuscular sort of view. It's almost like an atomic view, but not quite. So he's got this idea of these, sort of small things that make up the objects of our experience. But we can break down the objects of our experience into these two types of qualities, primary and secondary. So primary qualities are things like solidity, extension in three-dimensional space, figure, rest or motion, and number. These are primary. So I don't have to have a particular color. So say I have a book in front of me. That book could have a number of different colors, right? In the cover of the book, it could have a picture, it could have, multiple colors or a single color, letters, all of those things. Those things are sort of irrelevant to its solidity. I know that it's solid, it's extended in space. It has a particular figure, so it's rectangular. If it's sitting on my desk, or if it's your philosophy textbook that you're frustrated with and you've thrown across the room, it's in motion, and it's either a single thing or there are multiple things, right? So those are all primary qualities. Notice it doesn't matter the particulars of an object. All objects are going to have some kind of primary quality, and that goes for trees or anything else. I can say the word tree, and you might say, well, it's got a certain figure, it's extended in space, it's solid, it's got a number of different characteristics, qualities to it, without saying anything about the type of tree, right? What color is the tree? Is it an evergreen, or is it something with leaves that are changing? Is it the fall? Is it spring? All of those things, the color and things like the taste, sound, or smell, are all what Locke refers to as secondary qualities. So the secondary qualities adhere in the primary qualities. So I can have a solid cube, and that's solid and it's extended, right? It has a certain figure. I just said cube, right? So I've got all that. Those are primary. And then you might say, yes, but the cube, it turns out, is hollow. So when you knock on it, it has a hollow sound to it. It has a particular color. Say it's a yellow cube. I suppose it has a taste or smell, right? If it's a freshly painted cube, it would have the smell of paint. And I don't know if you want to go around licking cubes that have just been painted, but I'm sure it would have some kind of taste as well. And so those secondary qualities, though, inhere in the primary quality of the cube itself, its solidity, extension, figure, and so forth. So this is what Locke thinks are the origin of our ideas come from the qualities that we have in things, that we see, that we experience in external objects in the world. And that's where our idea. So every idea we have comes from something outside of ourselves that we then think about. We can reflect on it. You know, we have the sensation of it, and we can also reflect on it in various ways. Now, if you really think about it, any idea you have comes from some sort of previous experience. Even when I say something like, think of a chair. Now, all of you might have a different chair in mind, but notice all of your chairs seem to refer to some sort of chair that you've seen before. Or if it's not one you've exactly seen, it's one that you've put together from various different chairs. So you might say, well, I've got a completely new idea of a chair in my head. Okay, but where do the component pieces of that chair? The seat, the back, the armrests, or if there are arms on it, the legs, where did you get those ideas from? Oh, well, those ideas came from, I'm thinking of, well, what if you had a chair that used branches instead of actual legs? If we got sort of big branches and made a tree, replace the legs of a chair. Or what if the chair wasn't covered in any kind of material, but it was made of metal? So I have wooden legs that I got from thick branches, and now I have, a piece of scrap metal that I put, and I attach the legs to that scrap metal. And, I'm going to put a back on it, but the back is going to be something. Well, notice all of those little pieces that I'm thinking of come from other experience. I've had the experience of metal, or I've had the experience of various fabrics, and I've had, different shapes. All those things are just reworking of the same ideas I already have. So for Locke, all of our ideas, even new ideas, are coming from reflection on the various things that we've experienced in the world. Now, it's true, our mind can play with those things, and we can rearrange them and configure them in different ways. But notice, we're not actually coming up with something just innately, right? We don't know something innately. We don't have even a sort of mental representation of something just innately. It's, oh no, whatever I'm thinking of or imagining is something that I've come to by actually having some previous experience. Now, once we have those ideas in our mind, right, or those perceptions come in, I should say those experiences come in, there's different ways the mind then perceives those ideas, works with. So he starts with one, there's sort of an intuitive knowledge. And these are the sort of, we might think of these as the power of our understanding, what our mind can do. So intuitive knowledge is something like directly knowing something, right? So when he uses the word intuitive, it's a direct knowledge. So if I have a circle or a triangle in front of me, I know that one is not the other. Now you might say, wait a minute, didn't you just say that if someone didn't have sight and they didn't know the difference between, the pyramid that you put in front of them, the cube and the sphere, that they wouldn't know? And I say, no, what they wouldn't know is how to identify it just on sight. There's nothing innate about the notion of the label of that's a sphere, that's a cube, that's a pyramid. What they would know is that there are three different objects in front of them, right? They would know that of the three objects, the one in the middle is different than each of the two on the ends, right? That the pyramid is different than the cube is different than the sphere. So that they would know intuitively. They might not be able to identify which is which. He also thinks that we have an intuitive knowledge of our own existence. So one of the other things that Locke has is this idea of personal identity, right? Locke thinks that, look, there's an I that sort of sits above all of our experiences. So there's this self-awareness when you have a direct or intuitive knowledge of your own existence, of you as a person, and then you just simply have all these experiences. You, that person, that thing, sits above all your experiences. So in one sense, you're the same exact person you were when you were in kindergarten or first grade or second grade or whatever. And all that's changed is your experiences. But there's an I that sort of lives above all of that. And he thinks that knowledge, that understanding that you are an existing being is something that we know intuitively. And I also think this is demonstrative knowledge. This, of course, is very, very straightforward. It's just simply reasoning, right? So once we have various ideas, we can take those ideas or premises and come to conclusions based on those. So whether it's mathematical assumptions, right? We have the idea of addition. And if you understand what number is and understand what the addition means, we can actually reason from 1 plus 1 equals 2 is a reasoning. It's demonstrative knowledge. We can also look at our experience of the world and see how one thing causes another, and then we can sort of reason that way. So he thinks our mind has the capacity for understanding patterns of ideas and experiences. And then from that, we're able to reason. So again, that's a perception of the mind. When you sort of get the raw data from experience, the ideas, and then what you can do with those ideas, how the mind perceives those, comes from these various ways of knowing, right? You get this intuitive knowledge where immediately I look at the ideas. Because notice, once we have the idea in our head, so when I say, again, going back to that example, we've got a pyramid, a cube, and a sphere. I've got now knowledge of those, that each of those are different than the other, right? So that's in my mind. It came from experience, but now I'm actually just working with the ideas. So much in the way mentioned in Russell, look, we're all essentially working in ideas in our mind. Right? We're taking in these things. I don't see you, I see a representation of you. I don't see this desk, I see a representation of the desk in my mind. At the same time, Locke does not question that there's an external reality. He doesn't give you a very good reason why he thinks that there, other than to say, if our ideas aren't innate, they must come from something outside ourselves. And if they're coming something from somewhere outside of us, there must be a thing out there that exists. And so he accepts sort of this common sense notion. And of course, there's a third notion of knowledge, and that's sensitive knowledge, direct knowledge of an external object. So he thinks we can, of course, have just the sense of touch or sight or smell, that those things immediately create knowledge just coming from our senses. So even though it's sort of forming an idea, it's also an idea that's coming from something from experience. So if someone takes a needle and sticks it in your arm, and you immediately feel the pain. Okay, you've got a direct knowledge of the external object, right? There's a sort of sensitive knowledge, this perception in the mind that, I'm experiencing pain, right? Now, that pain is a form of sensitive knowledge, right? Same thing with a light. There's a bright light. I have a direct perception of that light. Now, I can also do other things with those ideas. I can, that light may form an idea of light in my head. So even when I'm no longer looking at the light, or imagine I'm looking at a candle and I see the light of the candle, and now I'm imagining a candle, I have an idea of a candle in my mind. All of that allows me to then do things with it, right? I can use it. I can do reasoning. I can understand that candle is something different than another candle or another light source. And I might have, and that may all have come from the sensitive knowledge that I had that came from direct knowledge of the external object, right? I looked into the light, or I felt the needle prick on my arm and that kind of thing. So for Locke, this then encompasses all our knowledge. All our knowledge is knowledge that comes from our experiences. But note also that for Locke then, this tells us that there's a limitation to our knowledge. So one of the things that Locke does in his political writings, the first and second treatise, maybe some of you have heard of Locke's second treatise on government. It's one of the famous sort of contractarian sort of views, right, where Locke views society as a contract between individuals. This idea, though, that we should reject something like the divine right of kings. Why would we reject the divine right of kings? Well, Locke actually, in his first treatise, is showing that we have a limited knowledge of both the divine, God, and of the successors to God. So the sort of, if God was the one who gave the power to Adam and Eve, and then Adam and Eve down to Cain and Abel, and so forth and so on, Locke actually points out that we're actually limited in our knowledge, not only of what a divine being's wishes are, because we can't know. All we can know is what we see from experience, but also who's the rightful ruler, right? Who is the rightful king or monarch? And so Locke rejects monarchy based on his epistemology, that given our limited knowledge, Locke wants to know, what can we know and how certain can we be about our knowledge and our ideas? And there's some things that simply are beyond our experience and therefore are beyond our knowledge. And so given that, we can't actually make an argument. I can't give you a demonstration that this is the rightful ruler in terms of divine right of kings. So Locke says, well, what can we do? We can know things about human beings and human nature and what motivates human beings and how human beings interact. But again, all of that is knowledge gained through experience. So there's a direct connection between epistemology, what we can know, and also things like social and political philosophy or ethics or other things. All right, so that's Locke. Locke is a classic sort of empiricist, and his theory of knowledge is in direct opposition to someone like Descartes, who's going to say, no, our knowledge can actually come from outside of experience. And Locke rejects that. Locke says, nope, all our knowledge is knowledge that comes from our senses, and then with what our mind does with those ideas that originate in experience.